And when my friend Tom Hartman has an extended conversation with somebody, he calls that series Conversations with Great Minds. And we're about to have an extended conversation with someone I think has a great mind and is a great writer. Good friend of the program, John Nichols, is the Washington or National Affairs correspondent for The Nation. He is the author of a number of important books, including Horsemen of the Trumpocalypse and People Get Ready. The subject of the first book is pretty much self-explanatory. The second one is a book about the rise of technology and what it will do to society. And he's also written books on socialism and many other topics. And he's been writing a lot of great stuff lately for The Nation. So I wanted to talk to him. So first of all, John, thanks for coming on the program.
It's an honor to be with you. And, it's a very funny thing that you and I talk very rarely except in a form that is recorded for posterity, which is sad because you're one of my favorite journalists, blah, blah, blah. I can say all the same nice things that you might say to me, but it's quite sincere. And so I'm honored to be with you, and I'm honored to have some time to talk because, one of my great frustrations with media, which, I've written a lot about over the years, is that it's gotten down to sub-sound bites now. And so I especially relish these moments where we go a little beyond the soundbite.
Yeah, well, thanks for saying that. I mean, that's something I miss in journalism too, and I figure as long as I've got 3 hours a week, let's have some conversations. And I wanted to have a conversation with you. I've been reading, as I always do, I've been reading what you write in The Nation, and I sort of see a number of these articles as almost plot points that help to create a three-dimensional picture of where our democracy is now. When you look when you read history, it always seems so neat and well structured, right? There was the Roosevelt era, there was the progressive era, there was the Gilded Age. I mean, it all, in retrospect, although Twain wrote about the Gilded Age while it was happening, and so on, it all seems to have a coherence in retrospect that it's hard to tease out at the time. Like Kierkegaard said, life can only be understood backwards, but it has to be lived forwards. I feel that way about politics too, but I feel somehow that you've touched on a number of important issues lately that might help us get a sense of what kind of era we are really in now. For example, you said net neutrality might be an important issue for the Democrats, and you've been tracking Scott Walker, the governor of your state, Wisconsin, blocking special elections, and interviewed Bernie Sanders about using alternative media, it seems, and what Connor Lamb's victory in Pennsylvania's 18th congressional district. I'm throwing a lot of things out, but I think there's kind of a pattern there that has to do with taking back the media, taking back the narrative, and sort of outlining the space of what we're up against in terms of people like Scott Walker undermining democracy. First of all, does all of that make any sense to you at all?
It makes total sense to me. But of course, I'm me, and I did write those pieces. So, I'm going to argue for a logic, whether there is one or isn't. But here's the bottom line. And I think you would share this with me, and I think it's an important construct. To be a journalist in these times, you must be what one author once described the philosopher Simone Weil as, a utopian pessimist. You have to actually be very optimistic and cynical at the same time. You have to recognize the incredibly awful things that are going on, the often nightmarish developments that are taking place, John Bolton being chosen as National Security Advisor, for instance. And yet, at the same time, you have to believe that if we look closely enough, we will see the alternatives rising, the ways out of this circumstance we're in. And so one of the things I try to do is to highlight a mix of reactions to things, and also initiatives where people are launching fights. At the bottom of it all is this concept. American democracy is in more peril today than, in my opinion, it is faced at any time in the modern age. I believe the modern age began actually in the 1960s when we finally began to complete some of the initial work. I want to underline that word initial. Complete some of the initial work as regards American democracy. With the passage of the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, a constitutional amendment that overturned the poll tax, with the enactment a few years later of 18 to 21-year-old voting, so people went to wars could actually have a say in whether we fought those wars. The advance of the women's movement, the advance of and the rise of LGBTQ movement and others. There was a moment there where we seem to be entering a modern age, where the franchise has been broadly extended, and where our politics, while not always perfect, often reflected the concerns of the people and the will of the people, summed up by the fact that Richard Nixon, no great hero, enacted the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, created the EPA. He didn't do that because he was a good environmentalist. He did that because we had enough of a small d democratic system where if people became aware of a problem and became angry about it and passionate about it, politicians had to respond. I think we're losing that today. I think that is profoundly threatened at the federal and state levels. And one of the things I write about is people that are assaulting it, people like Scott Walker, Donald Trump, and others. But at the same time, I'm also excited by the people who refuse to let it go and who are actually saying, no, we want to take that modern moment and extend it into now. And I see the people fighting for net neutrality and looking for creative ways to restore it, even under the assault of the Trump administration, as heroes who are, actually achieving things. So, in a roundabout way, the mix is a story of democracy under threat, but also of those who are not merely defending it, but seeking to extend it.
There's so much to unpack there. I think that's exactly right. I do think our democracy is under an unprecedented level of threat right now. I think that, and I think it's a multi-decades process, if not longer. I think that if we look back to the 60s and even the early 70s, by the way, one of the Nixon initiatives that didn't succeed was the minimum guaranteed income for all Americans that I believe came within one Senate vote of passage.
Well, it came close, and let me tell you two others, okay? As long as you're doing it, because I know you're getting to a point, but I'm going to interrupt you as you go.
Sure, feel free.
Two other things. We got within an inch of eliminating the Electoral College. And you realize if we'd eliminated the Electoral College, we wouldn't have had Bush or Trump, Bush 2 or Trump. So that's a pretty big deal. And then also, there's very little question that we were deep into serious discussions, including Republicans and Democrats, and including Republicans even associated with Nixon, about a national health care program.
Right.
So, we lost a lot along the way. Things went bad. And I think we can say very clearly that they went bad right around 72, 73 there, when we thought we were winning, going after Nixon on Watergate. But, soon-to-be Supreme Court Justice, this is actually 71 and 72, soon-to-be Supreme Court Justice Powell wrote his Powell memo, and he said to Power, look, we still have a lot of money. If we organize our money in the right way, buy media, create so-called think tanks, structurally intervene in the states and the federal levels, use the courts as a tool against extending democracy, not in favor of it, we can hold our own. The economic and political elites can stop the march of progress. He didn't say it in quite so many words. I'm translating for Americans. But the bottom line is that it was in the midst of this progress where we the people were actually forcing Republicans, conservative Republicans, to entertain ideas like getting rid of the Electoral College, doing a guaranteed income, doing national health care, doing environmental protection, because it was so popular, because we had a communication system that was beginning to tell us the truth, beginning to tell us some facts, and we had an electoral process, electoral systems that allowed us to respond. I think since the mid-1970s, there has been an aggressive effort by economic and political power, concentrated economic power, operating through its political extensions, to turn that clock back because they were terrified. They were horrified by the prospect that America might actually move to become a social democracy, which I think was something that was within the realm of possibility in those days.
And I think there was a sense of inevitability about the progress that you're describing. I think it's implicit in the way you describe it, that in the 60s and 70s, a lot of Americans believed that, well, as you say, things weren't perfect, but they're always going to get better along these lines. We're always going to get closer to what we would call a social democracy. We're going to continue to have increased prosperity that is shared between owners or employers and work. I always go back, John Nichols, to the Jetsons. In 1960, I mean, to me, that is the perfect encapsulation of that sense of optimism. And here's why. George Jetson had a job at Spacely Sprockets where he worked for 2 hours a week and on the job, working for 2 hours a week because of automation and those things, he earned enough to buy a spaceship-shaped house in the sky, a personal rocket car, and a family robot, and raise a family of 4 on one income. That, to me, that's the epitome of what everybody thought the future was going to look like. Because if you look at those charts that CEPR and CBBP and the different acronym economic groups put out, because increases in prosperity were tracking together between what was kept by corporations and what went to workers. And then in the 70s, right at the time that you're talking about, when the counterattack began, just a few short years later, those two lines diverged, and the amount that was going to what some would call, the profit-taking class or the rentier class, that kept going up, but the amount that was going to workers just flatlined. And that, to me,
summed it up.
Right?
That's exactly it. And the only thing you left out was that we were going to get jetpacks.
Yeah, and I still don't have
We didn't have to walk long distances. We get a jetpack. That was pretty cool. But you know what you're saying here, and this gets to the heart of what we wrote about in People Get Ready, Bob McChesney and I. One of the things that fascinated us in writing about the automation moment we are in today, the technological moment we are in today, which is a transformative moment, going to change everything about how we work, going to change everything about how we communicate. It's already affecting the technological changes that are taking place today are the reason why Donald Trump is president. We're starting to realize that as we talk about Facebook and Cambridge Analytics and things like that. And so, when we started writing that book, we thought we were writing about the future. It was only as we did the research that we realized we were writing about the past. Because in the 1960s, people, as you saw all this social progress and as you saw quite a bit of economic progress as well, in the 1960s, there was an understanding that we were about to make a great leap forward technologically, that it would be driven by computers and by data. We didn't imagine everything that would happen, but we knew something big was happening, and that it also would include automation of industry. Now, up to that point, there had been, because of the rise of the trade union movement, an understanding that as you had technological progress, because of the strength of the unions, you could have shared benefits from that progress. It didn't always happen. It could be difficult, there would be push and pull, but that possibility existed. And so what government was supposed to do was to analyze where we were going technologically, where we were going as regards automation and things like that, and figure out how to make sure that everybody got the benefit of it, that it was broadly shared. Studies were done in the 60s in which they talked about that. They framed that theory out. They explored these ideas, and then they put all of that work on the shelf. And then they said, influenced by, you start with the Powell memo, then you go with the right-wing sort of rise, the so-called new right in the late 70s, and then the Reagan era, they said, no, we're going to give the future to the market. We're going to let the market sort it out. And Democrats accepted that as well as Republicans. Failed leadership by Democrats often embraced the notion that, oh, well, we can't pick winners. We're going to let the market sort this out. But the end result is the market sorted it out. And you know what the market decided? Technological progress belonged to the rich. That the rich got to define it. They got to define who made money off it. They got to create monopolies from it. And the rest of us, we got to buy toys.
Right.
We did not get the benefits of that progress. And so when we understand it in that way, we should be really mad. Because over the last 40 years, somebody stole our future from us.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think that, one of the reasons why I, and among others, am constantly yammering, and again, we're talking with John Nichols of The Nation, and author of People Get Ready and Horsemen of the Trumpocalypse. I think one of the reasons why somebody like me yammers on about what's wrong with the internet and the way we use it is that this was a technology developed by the government. And the conscious decision was made by elected officials to turn the fruits of this public enterprise over to private enterprise that has used it to enrich itself beyond any conceivable reality ground. There is no way that Uber, for just to pick one example, should be valued in so many billions. I mean, and in terms of the worth of an idea and effort, yeah, they should have a nice $25 million company out of that thing. But whether it's Uber or Facebook or anything else, what we've found is we've really allowed ourselves to give away a public good, our technology, and to give away our attention, our time, our energy to a hypnosis and distraction machine, far more, people used to complain about television in the 60s and 70s, far more sophisticated and deliberately pernicious than television, without even talking about it.
Yeah, because it's interactive.
Right.
It's interactive television, right? It's like something that we can engage with at a higher level and tell ourselves that, some good is coming of it. But here's why you're so right and why it gets even scarier. You're right about everything you said, but now we have to understand what Facebook and so many of these other entities, even Uber, and we can explain this deeper if people want to go, depending on how far in you want to go on this. But the key thing is we didn't understand them in the sort of Ralph Ellison future vision, the Vonnegut understanding of the future, where we, looked at things and we recognized that perhaps there was peril in that which seemed wondrous, right? Mm-hmm. And what we are only today beginning to understand, is a company like Facebook is a mining company.
Right.
The traditional mining company, just like, some company going to try and get gold or trying to get, uranium out of the someplace, right?
Right.
Except that we're the minerals. We are the minerals. They're mining us. And so these companies, which are making unimaginable amounts of wealth, are making it via our data. They're collecting our data, packaging it up, and selling it. Cambridge Analytica is a joke. They're a bumbling bunch of amateur hour players. They're laughed at in the tech world.
Right.
But they understood one little concept. You could grab an immense amount of data and mess with all sorts of stuff. There are people who are doing it at a much more skilled level that we never talk about. Now, why this relates to all the things we're discussing right now is that we're in a situation where our data is being mined, our future is being controlled by people over whom we have little or no small democratic control. And why I worry about the state of American democracy at this point is that our democracy right now is insufficient to the challenge we face. And yet, instead of having this great big discussion, okay, how do we extend democracy beyond the traditional tools to economic democracy as well? How do we have a real conception of a 21st century democracy that allows citizens to make decisions about their future about how they will be used, about how they will be abused, and to begin to kind of shape something that they want, that is fair to them. Instead of doing that, we are seeing barriers put into place to democracy. We're seeing, limits on it. We're seeing the diminution of our press. We're seeing all of these, all of this often distraction, other times destruction, occurring at a critical moment. And the challenge for us today is to leap out of the moment we're in, to not get lost in the minutia of any day, and to say, absolutely, we have a right to a dramatically better and more realized democracy. That means that if our politicians tell us some things are not possible, that we can't do something, that there's a barrier here, there's a barrier there, there's a legal structure there, something like that, our answer ought to be naivete. It ought not be expertise. We ought to say, I don't understand what you're saying. We're human beings. We're a great mass of people. What do you mean we can't fix this thing? And you know who's practiced that politics? Because naivete is actually wisdom. It's genius. And you know who's practiced that politics?
Tell me.
All these kids who are out marching. All these kids who are out marching for gun control. Right? Because you told them, oh, you can't do that. That's not possible. You're just being naive. And you know what they've said? They said, okay, you want to call it naive? Fine. We call it is believing in something and seeking to achieve it. And we ought to take a lesson from them and extend it straight into these great battles that we're having right now. Members of Congress shouldn't be saying, Bolton he doesn't face congressional approval, and so we don't really have oversight power over John Bolton as Donald Trump's national security advisor. I don't know. Seems to me Congress has the power of the purse.
Right. Now, you wrote about that.
The power of the purse.
Yeah.
I mean, why do you accept these things? Why do we accept Scott Walker saying, I'm just not going to hold special elections in Wisconsin because it's inconvenient politically, or it might be costly, like democracy might cost too much. No. Why don't we say, I'm sorry, we live in a modern age where we can transfer trillions of dollars, via the internet, right? We can move money all over the world. We can move industries all over the world. We can do all this. And you're telling me we can't make sure that everybody's represented all the time?
Right.
That somehow filling vacancies for political offices is impossible? So bottom line is we need to look at all of these things that we started talking about here and say our answer is too soft. Our answer is too responsive to power rather than saying power should be responsive to us. And so really at the bottom line, what I'm arguing for is a transformative moment in our politics where we realize that it's an urgent time, but it's also a possible time. And again, I go back to these young people who are marching and who are shaking up politics all over the place and say, if 16 and 17-year-olds can go out and change the discourse as regards guns, we don't know how much they'll change it. We don't know where it'll end up. But if they can actually have a profound impact, then isn't it time for 35-year-olds and 45-year-olds and 55-year-olds to try and catch up with the 15 and 16-year-olds and show the same level of commitment? Pull on the whole armor and go out and fight?
John Nichols, if I could package that and distribute that on street corners, I would, because if there's one thing I would seek to eradicate from Democratic Party circles and media, even pretty good media folks and some of our colleagues, it is the world-weary eye roll of the person who says, that's the kind of thing that's just outside the realm of the politically possible, or it's not doable. You know who doesn't think like that, John? The guys who are trying to take down our democracy. They think big, they think long-term, and they go out there and they get it done. It's time for us to do that on behalf of the American people.
You nailed it, brother. That's exactly the right answer. And at the beginning of that, is to redefine what it is to demand the impossible. You know what I mean? Because there's so many words that we have in our politics now that tell us, what we can't do, right? They tell us you're naive. They tell us, well, you don't understand how the system works. They tell us you don't have enough money. And remember, that's what I told everybody who wanted to run for office. They said, well, you really have the money to be viable there. They tell us, well, you can't really get your word out because, media doesn't work the way it used to do. Or, there's so many times they tell us, well, we cannot do. Let me tell you something that we can do. What we can do is say, as a for instance, to the Democratic Party, if you folks won't do the basics to defend American democracy and to extend it, if you won't give us an agenda for making real the promise of democracy, so it is not merely just voting rights, but also economic rights. If you won't do that, we're just not going to deliver for you. It's not going to happen. And you know what? I'm not talking about something in the future. I'm not even proposing that. I think people should always participate and go all in. But what I'm saying is, I think that's already happened. I think a tremendous number of people have said, I don't expect anything from the Democratic Party, and so I'm not going to participate. And it's been devastating politically.
Oh,
you understand what I'm saying here? I'm not describing where we're going. I'm saying it's already happened.
Right.
And because it's happened, it's caused us to have a unimaginably dysfunctional politics. And so the Democratic Party needs to understand that its job is not merely to surf the moment. I think Democrats will probably have a good year this year. I think they'll do pretty well opposing Trump. But that's not sufficient, because if all you do is beat Donald Trump's allies this year, but you don't deliver something that's fundamentally different, that isn't real change moving in the right direction of economic democracy, then 2 years from now, 4 years from now, you're going to get beat right back into the same place where you were at. And so what's really necessary here is a rethink of what is the purpose of a political party? What is the purpose of candidates for office? What are they supposed to be doing? And the answer at the end of the day is the purpose of a political party, the purpose of a candidate is not merely to hire a manager to manage the current circumstance. It is to empower somebody to do change, to make change on your behalf. And if that little shift, that small shift were to occur, right, where people began to understand, oh yeah, I get it. If I vote Democratic, I'm going to get daycare for all. If I vote Democratic, I'm going to get single-payer Medicare for all. If I vote Democratic, I'm going to get guarantees of work and some sort of structural support, as you would have in any functional social democracy. Once that's understood, you watch, brother. You're going to end up with a remarkably different politics, and this is what terrifies concentrated economic and political power at this point. They are terrified that there might actually be a political force out there that says, yeah, if we get power, we're actually going to govern on behalf of the great mass of people.
Doesn't that mean a new crop of people running the Democratic Party and running for office and getting into activism? Doesn't that mean a changing of the guard?
It probably does. Look, I respect people who have fought long fights and who've been at the barricades for a long time, and I'm never going to dismiss them. I think there's wisdom that comes from people who've been in it for a long time. An example is Bernie Sanders, right? Mm-hmm. One of the reasons Bernie Sanders took off is not because he was a new player. It's actually because he'd been saying some of the same things for a very long time, and a lot of young people said, hey, finally, we see somebody we think actually believes this. We're going to vote for this guy. But I do basically agree with the concept that we do need a new generation, and frankly, we need a new understanding of politics. And here's where I would go. I was in Iceland, about 3 weeks ago. I spent a portion of the week with the new Prime Minister of Iceland. She is a 42-year-old feminist, social democrat, anti-militarist, environmentalist. She came to power because of playing politics smart. Her party did well in an election, and she built a coalition with centrists and even center-right folks by telling them, I'm not going to cede the basic concepts of our platform, but I want you to be a part of this because you're very concerned about infrastructure, or you're very concerned about healthcare. Come and join me. Let's build a coalition and rebuild some things. Let's rebuild some trust in our country. She built this coalition. Here's what she's done since taking office. She went to the Paris meetings in December and announced that Iceland wouldn't just do its goals as regards the Paris Accords, that it would beat them by 5 years. That Iceland would go faster toward a response to climate change because some countries were falling behind. On the local level, on the ground in her country, she has said that they will have full gender equality. They've already passed the laws, so she's implementing. Says we will have full gender equality in 5 years. We're not going to say, oh, it's going to happen eventually. We're setting a timeline. And when I asked her about, well, how about the whole economy? How do you deal with all this? She said, well, yeah, we're looking to, make sure that the banks actually put their money into places that will, guarantee a fair and functional economy, that will invest in what's necessary. And I said to her, well, that's going to be hard. We've had a hard time getting our banks to do things. And she said, yeah, but we kind of have an advantage. We own a couple of them.
Uh-huh. Right. Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? They're talking about creating a social bank in Iceland that would, literally put resources into, at very low interest rates, and that into the necessary build out of the country. And you say, well, okay, Iceland, that's a little tiny country, never happened anyplace else. Take a look at New Zealand. They have a 37-year-old social democratic prime minister who is in the midst of doing all sorts of incredible things. The fact is, if we look around the world, we are seeing an answer to our question. And the answer is that in countries around the world, young political figures, mostly women, are rising. They're taking charge of old and dysfunctional political parties. They are, in some cases, forming new political movements, and they are transforming politics. And you know what? It's working. It's actually succeeding. And so instead of believing that we're stuck, right, or believing the lie that says we're a big country so we can't do the things that little countries do, we ought to make a demand. And our demand ought to be that, the next time Eskow and Nichols get talking to each other, right, and they got all these great ideas, that, let's start looking for a 37-year-old woman or a 42-year-old woman who will actually go out and do it.
I think that is a great idea, and I think it's a great vision of the future, not just in this country, but globally, and it's an optimistic note. So unfortunately, although we have to end, fortunately, we get to end on a positive note, which is exactly the way I like to do things. And John Nichols, national correspondent for The Nation and author of books like People Get Ready and Horsemen of the Trump-Apocalypse, as always, great to talk to you, my friend.
Total pleasure, my friend.